Jag kom hit ikväll för att jag ville tala med dig om en sak. Jag har både blivit kär, förstår du. Ja, det är oerhört löjligt. Kanske är det alldeles åt helvete. Antagligen är det ett helvete.
Bergman is considered to be a difficult, for some reason, film director. But the film that you will see, Fanny and Alexander, is really a film full of joy. So you will see.
Det här är ingen hjältesaga, det är inte legendariskt, inte kriminellt men inte heller något lagligt. Ingen komedi men inte helt och hållet tragiskt. Ingen promenad i parken eller ett safari. Jag både strävar efter detta och vill inte ens ta i den sjukaste resan jag tvingats delta i. Bland änglar och demoner, men det fantar inte Hollywood. I verkligheten flaxar tiden snabbare än en kolibri. Den massproducerad i jakten på live quality och vilddjur i koppel som handsken håller i. Flocken är kollektiv, inga soloseglare kan överleva regelverket. Stegen räknas mer än det jag tar ormen vid svansen och gör det till
a space that is formed by the view that Ingmar Bergman had from his cottage in his house before an island, in this remote island
siktar med tanken och pickan vid höften, men blicken är blanken och trycket
much more concentrated on his images
i mörker, mycket vatten har runnit men inte stillat min törsten. Har nog
floating in the air,
men inte lyssnat förrän nu för mina tankebanor är som autostrader utan slut och det går in genom samma ära som det kommer ut för mina satellitkretsar.
Bergman and the other people that we haven't mentioned here are the source for the serious study of film. Cahiers du cinéma, the writings of André Bazin, film studies as an academic discipline, they are all born from Bergman, in a way.
That the Bergman films deals with central existential human questions and that we all are confronted with in our lives. So I don't think it's that hard to understand why he asked these questions. I think they are very common.
I'm not sure that he was asking hard questions as much as he was providing hard answers, but that's other directors think in images. Bergman does that to an extent, but he also writes down almost everything, you see. Throughout his career, whenever he was asked if he kept anything of his working materials, he would always say that I don't keep anything. But actually he had kept virtually everything, from first working notes to early drafts, to later drafts, to full handwritten manuscripts, to rewritten manuscripts, into the typewritten shooting script he would have kept.
Maybe the Swedish summers, and that was also a practical thing because Bergman worked in the theater and most of the year during autumn, winter and spring, and at the same time he was writing his film scripts, and when everybody had holiday in the summer, the actors also, he made his films. And so many of, and especially his early films, are very much about the fantastic Swedish summers with the long nights. I mean, we have in Stockholm about 19-20 hours of day and 4 or 5 hours of night. So of course it was also very practical. You could work longer hours if you had to. And you have films like Summer Interlude or Summer with Monica, some of his early films, and Smiles of a Summer Night.
I certainly agree with Steve that the summers seem of particular importance, but he has, as you know, even in the titles almost covered all the seasons. You have Autumn Sonata and Winter Light as well, and apart from Smiles of a Summer Night and Summer with Monica, etc. But it seems that spring is not the typical Bergman-esque kind of season, and it makes sense in a way. But the whole cliché conception of spring fits very badly with Bergman's temperament. and I think that autumn, or perhaps the encompassing heat of summer, or the depressing darkness of winter seems more pertinent to Ingmar Bergman's work.
But then you can also say that the landscapes, whenever there are landscapes in Bergman's films, because so many are just interiors, but the landscapes are not very typical Swedish ones. Already early on, like in The Seventh Seal and Sawdust and Tinsel, he chose landscape which are like for very barren, quite wild and almost medieval in a sense, or historical in a sense. It's more landscape, kind of existentialistic landscapes, landscapes of the soul than typical Swedish landscapes.
People outside of Scandinavia found the nature depicted exotic. And I think that Bergman's films have been sold by this very fact that, as you mentioned, perhaps in Korea the nature is very different from this one in Sweden. But there is also, and and this is even more important, I think that his films have been sold also because there is a very likely chance that once in a while you see a naked woman swimming in the Swedish summer. I think that the question of God in Bergman's films are often used as a kind of a metaphor for the lack of communication between people. The silence of God is more or less a metaphor for the problems of very human beings having problems with communication. And although I think, so in that sense, it makes perfect sense that, as you said, he was married 5 times and he had 9 children with, I think, 6 different women.
I was thinking about this also when I saw Fanny and Alexander again today. I mean, Bergman's, that he, in so many films, was dealing with faith and religion, of course comes from his upbringing. His father was a clergyman, and here when we see in the end of Fanny Alexander, Alexander is by himself and suddenly comes the bishop as a ghost, and he says to Alexander, "You will meet me again." And I mean, that's what happens in film after film. He was dealing with his father, the Bergman's clergyman father, and their relationship was not a very happy or easy one, I think.
As many people do not know, that Ingmar Bergman started out in the early 1940s as an advocate for Christianity. He was a very profoundly believing Christian at that point. Then, some years later, he said himself that he became an atheist, although he has been called a Protestant atheist, which I think is a very apt description of him, because you can always feel, or you can always see in his films, that they are deeply religious in their ethics and in their and even in small details. Although Bergman, I think that I would go on record saying that the true answer to that question is that I think that Bergman himself felt that it is irrelevant if there is a God or not. In that sense that he is agnostic. That whether there is a God or not is less relevant than what we do to each other on this planet. So, as you said, in Saraban we have, and he has said this in interviews himself, that I'm sure that I will meet my wife, his last wife, apparently only her, when I die. But and that is something that is said in Saraban as well. And I think he, throughout his life, he was, as I guess many of us, was pondering the question all over again. And but at some point he realized that that is less relevant, at least, than what happens here on Earth. But I think it is wrong to dismiss his religious inclination, or to think of it as totally irrelevant. As I think it is equally wrong to say that it is the driving force of his films. So it is complicated, I'm afraid. Bergman is now recognized as a playwright as much as he is a filmmaker, which because of the fact that quite a few, some 20 of his films have been adapted for theatre. Like, for instance, the Autumn Sonata, which perhaps you saw was performed in Seoul a few years ago. In fact, Ingmar Bergman is the most performed Swedish playwright at the moment, even more than August Strindberg.
In the beginning of the 50s, Bergman himself, he bought a small cine camera, a 9.5mm camera, which existed at that time. And he was filming himself, mainly during shooting, and he filmed his actresses in between takes, and also at that time he was privately engaged in two actresses, first Harriet Andersson and then Bibi Andersson, and there were very loving footage of which he had shot of these two actresses. When he made Sawdust and Tinsel in 1953, I think, he had somebody who was taking documentary films of him at work. And this continued over the years, not for all of his films, but there are lots and lots of material being shot of where we see him at work.
It would be ridiculous to think that he is a director that would be for everybody. He's not Steven Spielberg. It is complicated, and maybe that's one of the lessons that we could draw from Bergman. Life indeed is complicated.